In the quiet suburban streets of Willowbrook Heights, where morning joggers passed identical townhouses and children waited for yellow school buses beneath oak trees that had witnessed 3 decades of ordinary dreams, Daniel Scott thought he understood the boundaries of his carefully constructed life. A divorced architect raising his precocious 14-year-old daughter Grace, he'd grown accustomed to the gentle rhythm of their two-person household. Weekend pancakes served with Grace's latest linguistic discoveries, evening homework sessions that often turned into impromptu language lessons, and the comforting predictability of a routine built around a child whose extraordinary mind demanded extraordinary patience. But when a seemingly innocent summer internship at the towering glass headquarters of Meridian Global Corporation would collide with Grace's uncanny ability to understand conversations that powerful people assumed no one could comprehend, the question would emerge: can a teenager's gift for languages expose a conspiracy that threatens to destroy hundreds of thousands of lives? Before we dive into this incredible story of courage, deception, and the power of communication, tell us in the comments where you're watching from around the world, and if this story of a young girl's bravery resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow we have something even more extraordinary waiting for you. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows of their modest townhouse on Maple Ridge Drive, casting dancing shadows across the breakfast table where Daniel Scott sat with his second cup of coffee, architectural blueprints spread beside his cereal bowl. At 38, Daniel carried himself with the quiet strength of a man who'd learned to be both mother and father to a child whose intellectual gifts often left him feeling like he was running to catch up. His weathered hands, stained with the permanent marks of pencil lead and coffee, spoke of late nights spent designing affordable housing projects while simultaneously helping Grace with homework that challenged his own understanding of the world. "Dad, did you know that the Swahili phrase Hakuna Matata literally translates to 'there are no troubles', but in Mandarin the closest equivalent would be a shakwis, which actually means no problem, but carries a completely different cultural context about problem-solving versus trouble avoidance." Grace Scott's voice carried the particular enthusiasm that had characterized her relationship with languages since she was old enough to speak. At 14, Grace possessed her mother's curious green eyes and her father's stubborn determination, but she'd developed something entirely her own, an almost supernatural ability to absorb, retain, and speak languages with native-level fluency. What had begun as childhood fascination with her grandmother's Spanish lullabies had evolved into mastery of 12 distinct languages, each one opening doors to cultural understanding that amazed teachers, linguists, and occasionally worried her father, who sometimes felt like he was raising a young diplomat rather than a typical teenager. Daniel looked up from his blueprints, his face softening into the kind of smile reserved exclusively for moments when his daughter's brilliance reminded him why every sacrifice had been worth it. "I did not know that," he replied, setting down his coffee cup to give her his full attention. "What sparked this particular linguistic revelation this morning?" Grace approached the table with the confident stride of someone who'd learned that her father's world always had space for her intellectual curiosity. She carried her worn journal, a leather-bound notebook that contained vocabulary lists, cultural observations, and linguistic patterns in at least 8 different writing systems. "I was reading about corporate communication failures across cultural boundaries for my summer internship application," she explained, opening the journal to reveal pages covered in meticulous notes written in multiple languages. The mention of the internship brought a familiar tightness to Daniel's chest. Grace had been selected for a prestigious summer program at Meridian Global Corporation, one of the city's largest international consulting firms. While he was proud of her achievement, the thought of his 14-year-old daughter navigating the complex world of corporate business made his protective instincts flare. Meridian Global's gleaming headquarters dominated the downtown skyline, its 40-story tower housing departments that managed billions of dollars in international contracts, government partnerships, and multinational acquisitions. "Remind me again what you'll be doing at Meridian," Daniel asked, though he'd heard the details multiple times. Something about the corporate environment made him uneasy, though he couldn't articulate exactly why. Grace's eyes lit up with the particular joy that came from discussing opportunities to use her linguistic abilities in real-world applications. "I'll be working with their international communications department, helping translate documents and providing cultural context for their global partnerships. Ms. Rodriguez said they specifically requested someone with my language skills, because they're expanding into 12 new markets this year. Elena Rodriguez, Grace's high school guidance counselor, had been instrumental in securing the internship opportunity. A former corporate translator herself, Ms. Rodriguez understood the value of Grace's abilities and had personally recommended her to Meridian's Human Resources Department. The position offered academic credit, a small stipend, and most importantly for Grace, the chance to use her languages in professional settings rather than just academic exercises. Daniel studied his daughter's excitement and felt the familiar conflict between protection and opportunity that had defined his parenting since his divorce 3 years earlier. Grace's mother, Catherine, had moved to Seattle for a career opportunity, leaving Daniel with primary custody and the challenge of nurturing a child whose intellectual gifts sometimes made her seem older than her years, while simultaneously maintaining the boundaries appropriate for someone who was still fundamentally a teenager. "Just promise me you'll be careful about office politics," Daniel said, folding his blueprints with the practiced efficiency of someone whose morning routines had been honed by years of single parenthood. "Corporate environments can be complicated, especially for someone your age." Grace nodded solemnly, understanding that her father's concern came from love rather than doubt about her abilities. "I'll stick to translations and cultural research," she promised. Ms. Rodriguez said the internship is designed to be educational, not to put me in any complicated business situations. As they prepared to leave for their respective days, Daniel to his architecture firm in the Arts District, Grace to her final week of sophomore year at Willowbrook Heights High School, neither could have imagined that Grace's linguistic abilities would soon uncover conversations that were never meant to be understood by outside ears. The corporate world that awaited her carried secrets that powerful people had carefully hidden behind languages they assumed no American teenager could possibly comprehend. The walk to Grace's school took them down familiar streets, lined with houses that told the story of middle-class dreams and middle-class struggles. Daniel had chosen this neighborhood specifically for its excellent public schools and the kind of community stability that he'd wanted to provide for Grace after the disruption of divorce. Mrs. Chen from the corner house waved from her garden where she was tending to the last of her spring vegetables. Mr. Washington, who ran the small market at the end of their street, called out a greeting in his warm Caribbean accent that always made Grace smile and respond in perfect Jamaican patois, much to his delight. "Okay." These interactions, brief but genuine, formed the fabric of their community, threads of connection that had supported Daniel and Grace through the difficult transition from married family to father-daughter team. Willowbrook Heights was the kind of place where people still knew their neighbors' names and where Grace's linguistic gifts were seen as a wonderful quirk rather than something that set her apart from her peers. "Will you pick me up today, or am I taking the bus?" Grace asked as they approached the school's front entrance, where students were streaming in with the chaotic energy of teenagers anticipating summer freedom. "I'll be here at 3:15, Daniel promised, adjusting her backpack straps with the practiced efficiency of single parenthood. "And maybe we'll stop by the library afterward. I want to research Meridian Global a bit more before your internship starts next week." Grace's expression showed a flicker of concern. "Dad, you're not going to become one of those overprotective parents who Googles everything, are you?" Daniel laughed, recognizing his own tendency toward excessive caution when it came to Grace's safety and well-being. "I'm going to become a parent who does his homework," he replied. "There's a difference between being protective and being prepared." As Grace disappeared into the school building with a final wave, Daniel stood for a moment watching the morning bustle of teenagers, teachers, and parents navigating the complex social ecosystem of public education. His daughter moved through this world with the confidence of someone who'd learned to bridge cultural and linguistic gaps effortlessly, making friends across the diverse student body that reflected Willowbrook Heights' evolution from suburban homogeneity to multicultural community. What Daniel couldn't have known, standing there in the morning sunshine while planning to research the company where Grace would soon work, was that Meridian Global Corporation housed secrets that threatened far more than just corporate profits. Within its gleaming walls, powerful executives had been orchestrating a conspiracy that would soon test everything Grace had learned about the power of communication, the responsibility that came with understanding, and the courage required to speak truth when silence would be so much safer. The ordinary world they'd built together, father and daughter, architect and linguist, protector and protected, was about to be challenged by forces that had never imagined a 14-year-old's gift for languages could pose any threat to their carefully guarded secrets. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The 42nd floor of Meridian Global Corporation buzzed with the controlled chaos of international business, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city that made Grace feel simultaneously exhilarated and overwhelmed. On her first day of the summer internship, she clutched her leather journal and followed Jessica Park, the communications department coordinator, through a maze of glass-walled conference rooms where executives spoke in rapid bursts of English, Mandarin, and what sounded like Arabic. "Your workspace is here," Jessica announced, gesturing toward a small desk positioned strategically between the main translation department and the executive conference area. "You'll be working primarily with translation verification and cultural context research. Most of our regular translators are excellent, but we've been having some inconsistencies with certain international contracts." Grace settled into her chair, noting immediately that her position offered clear sightlines into 3 different conference rooms and the executive elevator bank. The setup seemed intentional, though she couldn't determine whether it was meant to include her in the corporate environment or to monitor her activities. Her teenage instincts, sharpened by years of navigating high school social dynamics, detected an undercurrent of tension that the professional smiles and warm welcomes couldn't quite mask. It was during her second hour of reviewing routine trade agreements that Grace first noticed her. In the far corner of the executive floor, partially hidden behind a pillar near the emergency stairwell, stood a woman who seemed fundamentally out of place in Meridian's polished corporate environment. She appeared to be in her late 20s, wearing an expensive business suit that couldn't disguise the haunted quality in her dark eyes or the way she moved, with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to avoid drawing attention to herself. The woman, Drive. Amira Hassan, according to the employee directory Grace had studied, was listed as a senior international consultant, but her behavior suggested something far more complex than routine business consulting. She spoke in hushed whispers during brief phone conversations, always in languages that Grace recognized as Arabic, Farsi, and occasionally what sounded like Kurdish. Most troubling, Dr. Hassan seemed to be watching the executive offices with the same intensity that Grace had learned to associate with people who were afraid of being discovered. Grace's linguistic abilities had always made her sensitive to the emotional undertones carried in different languages, and Dr. Hassan's conversations carried weight that went far beyond normal business discussions. During what should have been a routine call about market research, Grace heard fragments that made her stomach tighten with concern. "The villages don't know what's coming," spoken in Arabic, followed by, "The water tests are being falsified," in heavily accented English, and most disturbing, "How many more children have to get sick before someone listens," whispered in Farsi. The breakthrough came on Grace's third day when Dr. Hassan approached her desk during the afternoon lull when most executives were in meetings or had left early for client dinners. She moved with the careful steps of someone approaching a potential ally while simultaneously preparing for disappointment or betrayal. "Excuse me," Dr. Hassan said softly, her accent carrying traces of multiple Middle Eastern regions. "I've been watching you work with the translation documents. Your supervisor mentioned that you speak several languages?" Grace looked up from the contract she'd been reviewing, a seemingly routine mining agreement for operations in 3 different countries, and immediately noticed that Dr. Hassan's hands were trembling slightly. "I speak 12 languages," Grace replied carefully, sensing that this conversation carried more significance than a casual workplace interaction. "Are you having trouble with the translation?" Dr. Hassan glanced around the office area, checking to ensure their conversation wouldn't be overheard, then leaned closer to Grace's desk. "Not exactly," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I think someone here needs to understand what I've been trying to say. But every time I submit reports in English, they get buried or dismissed. Maybe if someone younger, someone they trust, could help me." The desperation in Dr. Hassan's voice was unmistakable, and Grace felt her protective instincts engage, the same response she'd always had to classmates who were being bullied or excluded. "What kind of reports?" she asked, gesturing for Dr. Hassan to sit in the empty chair beside her desk. Dr. Hassan's relief was immediate and profound. She reached into her briefcase and extracted a folder thick with documents written in multiple languages, her movements quick and furtive, as if she expected the papers to be confiscated at any moment. "Environmental impact assessments," she said, spreading several documents across Grace's desk while continuing to monitor the surrounding office area. "Water contamination studies. Health surveys from villages near Meridian's mining operations in Kurdistan, Yemen, and 3 locations in Syria." Grace's eyes widened as she began scanning the documents, her linguistic abilities allowing her to process information that Dr. Hassan had clearly struggled to communicate to her English-speaking supervisors. The papers contained scientific data, medical reports, and testimonials from local communities, all documenting environmental disasters and health crises that appeared to be direct results of Meridian Global's international operations. "These villages," Grace said quietly, pointing to photographs of children with visible signs of malnutrition and skin conditions. "They're all near Meridian mining sites?" Dr. Hassan nodded, tears forming in her eyes as she watched Grace comprehend information that she'd been trying to communicate for months. "The water supplies have been contaminated by mining runoff. The soil is poisoned. Children are developing respiratory diseases, skin disorders, and developmental delays. I've been submitting these reports for 8 months, but every time I try to explain the severity to the executives, they tell me the data is inconclusive or requires further study." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of expensive shoes clicking across the marble floor. Dr. Hassan immediately began gathering her documents with practiced speed, while Grace pretended to return her attention to the routine translation work spread across her desk. Victoria Sterling, Meridian's chief operations officer, approached with the kind of predatory smile that Grace had learned to recognize from dealing with manipulative teachers and school administrators. "Dr. Hassan," Victoria said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance, "I've been looking for you. We need to discuss your latest submissions to the Environmental Review Board." Dr. Hassan's transformation was immediate and heartbreaking. The desperate woman who'd been sharing evidence of humanitarian crisis became a careful, subdued employee who avoided eye contact while gathering her materials. "Of course, Miss Sterling. I was just asking our intern about some translation clarifications." Victoria's gaze shifted to Grace with a kind of assessment that made her feel like a specimen being examined under a microscope. "Miss Scott, isn't it? How are you finding your internship experience? I hope Dr. Hassan hasn't been burdening you with work that's beyond your scope." The warning in Victoria's tone was subtle, but unmistakable. Grace felt the same chill she'd experienced when facing down school bullies who used authority and intimidation to silence potential witnesses to their behavior. "She was just asking about some technical vocabulary," Grace replied, matching Victoria's professional tone while internally cataloging every detail of the interaction for later analysis. "Excellent," Victoria said, though her smile never reached her eyes. "Dr. Hassan, shall we continue this conversation in my office?" As the 2 women walked away, Grace noticed that Dr. Hassan had left behind a single document. Whether intentionally or by accident, she couldn't determine. The paper contained a handwritten note in Arabic script, and Grace's heart rate increased as she translated the desperate message. "If something happens to me, the evidence is hidden in the emergency stairwell, level 38. The children in Al Rashid village have been drinking poisoned water for 6 months. Someone must tell their story." Grace stared at the note, understanding that she'd just been entrusted with information that could expose corporate malfeasance on an international scale. Dr. Hassan wasn't just a concerned employee. She was a whistleblower whose attempts to protect vulnerable communities had been systematically suppressed by the very company that employed her. More troubling, her cryptic reference to "if something happens to me" suggested that she believed her safety was at risk. The afternoon passed in a haze of routine translation work while Grace's mind raced with the implications of what she'd learned. Dr. Hassan didn't return to the office floor, and inquiries about her whereabouts were met with vague responses about client meetings and field research. By closing time, Grace had made a decision that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of her internship and potentially her life. As the office emptied and security guards began their evening rounds, Grace made her way to the emergency stairwell on the 38th floor. Dr. Hassan's hidden evidence would either validate her concerns about environmental contamination and corporate cover-ups, or reveal the paranoid delusions of someone whose judgment had been compromised by stress and cultural isolation. What Grace found taped inside a maintenance panel would prove that some secrets were too dangerous to remain hidden, and that a 14-year-old's gift for languages had made her the only person capable of understanding the full scope of Meridian Global Corporation's crimes against vulnerable communities on 3 continents. The vulnerable person had appeared in Grace's life not as a victim seeking rescue, but as a professional woman whose expertise and moral courage had made her a target for corporate retaliation. Dr. Amira Hassan's desperation to communicate the truth about environmental disasters would soon test everything Grace had learned about the responsibility that came with understanding, and the courage required to amplify voices that powerful people were determined to silence. The maintenance panel on the 38th floor emergency stairwell contained more than Grace had expected, and far worse than she'd feared. Dr. Hassan's hidden cache included 3 waterproof folders filled with photographs, medical reports, water quality analyses, and testimonials from village elders written in Arabic, Kurdish, and Farsi. As Grace carefully examined each document under the dim emergency lighting, a picture emerged of systematic environmental destruction that made her hands shake with a combination of anger and terror. The photographs were the most damning evidence. Images of children with severe skin lesions drinking from wells that sparkled with an unnatural metallic sheen, livestock lying dead in fields where the grass had turned brown despite abundant rainfall, village women holding empty water containers, their faces etched with the desperation of mothers watching their children suffer from illnesses they couldn't understand or treat. Grace's fluency in Arabic allowed her to read the handwritten testimonials that accompanying each photograph. "My daughter Fatima developed breathing problems 3 months after the mining began," one mother had written. "The doctors in the city say her lungs are damaged, but we cannot afford the treatment. The company men told us the water is safe, but our animals die when they drink from the stream." Another testimony, written in careful Kurdish script, described birth defects in babies born after Meridian's operations began. 7 children in our village were born with deformed limbs this year. Before the mining, our children were healthy. The company doctor says it is coincidence, but our midwives know better. The scientific reports were equally devastating. Dr. Hassan had conducted independent water quality tests that revealed heavy metal contamination at levels 40 times higher than international safety standards. Soil samples showed mercury, lead, and arsenic concentrations that would require decades of remediation to restore to agricultural viability. Most disturbing were the health surveys documenting respiratory diseases, neurological disorders, and developmental delays among children living within 5 kilometers of Meridian's extraction sites. Grace photographed each document with her phone, her teenage familiarity with technology allowing her to capture high-resolution images even in the poor lighting of the stairwell. She understood intuitively that this evidence needed to be preserved and distributed beyond Meridian's corporate control, but the magnitude of what she'd discovered left her uncertain about how to proceed safely. The sound of footsteps echoing from several floors below sent Grace into immediate panic mode. She quickly returned the documents to their hiding place, sealed the maintenance panel, and began climbing toward the 42nd floor with the casual pace of someone taking the stairs for exercise rather than conducting corporate espionage. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she emerged into the main office area, where a few dedicated employees were still working despite the late hour. The next morning brought a development that confirmed Grace's worst fears about Dr. Hassan's safety. Jessica Park gathered the communications department staff for what she described as a, quote, routine personnel update, but her nervous energy suggested something far more serious had occurred overnight. "Dr. Hassan has accepted a transfer to our Dubai office," Jessica announced, avoiding eye contact with the assembled employees. "Her expertise in Middle Eastern environmental consulting will be valuable for our expanding operations in that region. She'll be leaving immediately to begin orientation with our international partners." Grace felt her stomach drop as she processed the implications of this announcement. Dr. Hassan hadn't mentioned any transfer during their conversation, and her desperate urgency about exposing the environmental contamination made a voluntary relocation seem highly unlikely. The timing, less than 24 hours after their meeting, suggested that Victoria Sterling had discovered their interaction and taken immediate action to remove the potential whistleblower from the situation. During her lunch break, Grace attempted to contact Dr. Hassan through the company directory, only to discover that her extension had already been disconnected and her email account deactivated. When she asked Jessica about how to reach Dr. Hassan for follow-up questions about their translation work, she was told that all communication with transferred employees had to be routed through human resources for security and confidentiality reasons. The afternoon brought Grace's first direct experience with corporate intimidation tactics. Victoria Sterling appeared at her desk during the quiet period when most employees were in meetings, carrying a folder that she placed deliberately within Grace's view. "Miss Scott," Victoria said, settling into the chair that Dr. Hassan had occupied the previous day, "I wanted to check in about your internship experience. Are you finding the work challenging enough? Sometimes young people need more stimulation to stay engaged." Grace recognized the probing nature of Victoria's questions and responded with the careful politeness she'd learned from navigating difficult conversations with school administrators. "The translation work is very interesting. I'm learning a lot about international business communications." "Excellent," Victoria replied, opening her folder to reveal what appeared to be Grace's personnel file. "Your supervisor mentioned that you've been asking questions about some of our international operations. Curiosity is wonderful in young people, but sometimes corporate environments involve confidential information that can be misunderstood without proper context." The warning was delivered with a smile that never reached Victoria's eyes. Grace felt the same chill she'd experienced when dealing with bullies who used psychological pressure rather than physical confrontation to control their targets. "I understand," Grace said carefully. "I'm just trying to do good work on the translations I've been assigned." Victoria's expression shifted to something that might have been approval, though Grace suspected it was actually satisfaction at what she perceived as successful intimidation. "I'm sure you are. You know, Miss Scott, internship programs like this one can be excellent stepping stones to future opportunities. Students who demonstrate discretion and maturity often find that doors open for them in ways they never expected." The implication was clear: cooperation would be rewarded, while curiosity about sensitive topics could jeopardize Grace's future prospects. Victoria left the personnel file on Grace's desk, open to a page that detailed the internship's evaluation criteria and the potential for recommendation letters that could influence college admissions and scholarship opportunities. After Victoria departed, Grace sat staring at the file while processing the sophisticated nature of the pressure tactics being employed against her. These weren't the crude threats of playground bullies, but carefully calculated manipulations designed to exploit her teenage concerns about academic achievement and future success. The message was clear. Asking questions about Dr. Hassan or environmental contamination could damage her prospects for college and career advancement. That evening, Grace walked home from the bus stop, with her mind racing through potential strategies for exposing what she'd learned without triggering corporate retaliation that could harm both her and Dr. Hassan. The comfortable suburban streets of Willowbrook Heights felt surreal after spending the day immersed in evidence of corporate crimes that were destroying communities thousands of miles away. Daniel was waiting at the kitchen table with Chinese takeout and the expectant expression of a father hoping to hear about his daughter's exciting day at her prestigious internship. Grace felt the weight of the secret knowledge she now carried, understanding that involving her father would potentially put him at risk while simultaneously recognizing that she needed adult guidance to navigate the dangerous situation she'd stumbled into. "How was day 4 at the corporate headquarters?" Daniel asked, distributing food with the practiced efficiency of their dinner routine. "Are you getting the hang of the business world?" Grace studied her father's face, noting the genuine interest and parental pride that motivated his questions. Daniel had worked hard to provide opportunities for her intellectual development, and the Meridian internship represented everything he'd hoped to achieve: recognition of Grace's abilities, professional experience, and connections that could facilitate her future success. "It's more complicated than I expected," Grace said carefully, testing her father's response to hints about workplace difficulties. "Some of the international consulting work involves sensitive situations that are hard to understand without more context." Daniel's expression shifted to the focused attention he brought to conversations that might involve problems requiring parental intervention. "What kind of sensitive situations? Are you being asked to work with material that's inappropriate for someone your age?" The question gave Grace an opening to share her concerns without immediately revealing the full scope of what she'd discovered. There's a consultant, Dr. Hassan, who's been working on environmental impact studies for some of our international operations. She seemed really concerned about the data she was collecting, but then she was suddenly transferred to Dubai. It felt like she was trying to tell someone about problems that weren't being addressed properly. Daniel's parental instincts immediately engaged at the mention of an adult employee who seemed distressed. His experience with workplace dynamics, while limited to architectural firms rather than international corporations, had taught him to recognize when professional situations involved more than routine business challenges. What kind of problems was she concerned about, he asked, setting down his chopsticks to give Grace his full attention. Grace took a deep breath, understanding that her next words would fundamentally alter their relationship from parent protecting child to allies confronting a shared challenge. Environmental contamination that's making children sick in villages near our mining operations. Water pollution, soil contamination, health problems that the company seems to be covering up instead of addressing. The silence that followed lasted several minutes while Daniel processed the implications of what Grace had told him. His daughter's linguistic abilities had given her access to information that revealed corporate malfeasance on an international scale, and her teenage sense of justice was compelling her to take action, despite the obvious risks to her safety and future prospects. "Grace," Daniel said finally, his voice carrying the weight of parental concern mixed with recognition of his daughter's moral courage. "These are the kinds of allegations that can destroy companies and careers. Are you absolutely certain about what you've seen?" Grace retrieved her phone and showed her father the photograph she'd taken of Dr. Hassan's hidden evidence. Daniel's expression grew increasingly grave as he examined images of contaminated water sources, sick children, and environmental destruction that bore the clear signatures of industrial pollution. "We need help," he said quietly, understanding that their family's peaceful existence was about to be complicated by forces far beyond their previous experience. "This isn't something a 14-year-old should have to handle alone. And it's not something I know how to manage either." The first connection attempt had succeeded beyond Grace's expectations, but it had also revealed the sophisticated nature of the opposition they would face and the genuine danger that threatened both Dr. Hassan and anyone who attempted to amplify her silenced voice. The breakthrough came at 2:47 a.m. when Grace's phone buzzed with a message from an encrypted number she didn't recognize. The text was written in Arabic script. "Young friend who speaks many languages, I am safe but watched. The evidence you found is only the beginning. Check your email for account I made for you. Password is the Kurdish word for truth, spelled backwards. Delete this message immediately." Grace's heart raced as she quickly memorized the information and deleted the text. Dr. Hassan had somehow managed to contact her despite being under corporate surveillance, which meant the environmental consultant was not only alive but actively working to expose Meridian's crimes from her forced exile in Dubai. More importantly, she'd recognized Grace as someone who could continue the investigation that had made her a target for corporate retaliation. The email account contained a treasure trove of additional evidence that Dr. Hassan had apparently been collecting for months before their meeting. Satellite imagery showing the progression of environmental damage around Meridian's mining sites. Internal company memos discussing, quote, acceptable casualty rates for what executives euphemistically called extraction externalities. Most damning of all, recorded phone conversations between Meridian executives and government officials in 3 different countries, discussing bribes, permit falsifications, and the deliberate suppression of environmental impact studies. Grace spent the pre-dawn hours translating and organizing the new evidence, her linguistic abilities allowing her to process documents in 6 different languages that revealed the scope of Meridian's international operations. The company wasn't just extracting minerals from environmentally sensitive regions. They were systematically corrupting regulatory processes, bribing local officials, and threatening scientists who attempted to document the health consequences of their activities. One audio recording particularly chilled Grace's blood. Victoria Sterling's voice, speaking in fluent Arabic to what appeared to be a Syrian government official. "The water contamination reports need to disappear permanently. Dr. Hassan's transfer should resolve the immediate problem, but if she continues making noise from Dubai, we may need to consider more permanent solutions to protect our investment." The implications were terrifying. Victoria wasn't just covering up environmental damage, she was discussing potential violence against Dr. Hassan if the whistleblowing continued. Grace realized that her own safety might now be at risk, since Victoria suspected that Dr. Hassan had shared information with someone inside Meridian's offices. When Daniel discovered Grace at the kitchen table surrounded by printed documents and her laptop displaying satellite images of devastated mining sites, his parental concern transformed into something approaching panic. "Grace, what are you doing up at this hour? And what is all this?" He gestured at the evidence spread across their breakfast table, his architect's eye immediately recognizing the systematic documentation that characterized serious investigative work. Grace looked up at her father with eyes that seemed to have aged years in the space of a few days. "Dr. Hassan contacted me. She's alive, but she's being watched." "Dad, this is so much worse than I initially thought. They're not just covering up environmental damage. They're threatening people who try to expose the truth." Daniel sat down heavily in his chair, studying the documents with growing alarm. The satellite images showed clear environmental destruction. Rivers turned orange with chemical runoff, vegetation dead for miles around extraction sites, and what appeared to be mass graves near several mining operations. "Sweetheart," Daniel said carefully, "these are the kinds of allegations that require federal investigation. This isn't something we can handle through normal channels. If Meridian Global is involved in international corruption and environmental crimes, they have resources and connections that could make them extremely dangerous to anyone who threatens their operations." Grace nodded solemnly, understanding that her father's concerns were entirely justified while simultaneously feeling the weight of responsibility for the villages full of sick children, whose suffering was being systematically ignored by adults who prioritized profits over human life. "I know it's dangerous," she said quietly. "But Dr. Hassan risked everything to document this evidence, and now she's essentially in exile because she tried to protect people who can't protect themselves. If I don't help her, who will? How many more children have to get sick before someone with the ability to understand these documents decides to act?" The question hung between them like a bridge spanning the gap between Grace's teenage idealism and Daniel's parental pragmatism. He recognized in his daughter's expression the same moral determination that had motivated her mother to volunteer with refugee assistance programs and her grandmother to march for civil rights, despite facing serious personal consequences. Their strategy session was interrupted by the sound of Daniel's phone ringing with a call from an unknown number. When he answered, a woman's voice spoke in accented English. "Mr. Scott, this is Dr. Amira Hassan. I believe your daughter has been helping me with some translation work. I'm calling from Dubai, and I need to speak with both of you about a matter of extreme urgency." Daniel put the call on speaker, allowing Grace to participate in what would become their first direct planning conversation with the woman whose evidence had thrust them into international corporate conspiracy. "Dr. Hassan," Grace said immediately, "are you safe? The audio recording I found suggested that Victoria Sterling might be planning to hurt you if you continue speaking out." Dr. Hassan's voice carried a mixture of gratitude and desperation. "I am safe for now, but only because I have been very careful about my communications and movements. Grace, your linguistic abilities have allowed you to understand evidence that I could never successfully present to English-speaking authorities, but I need you to know that continuing this investigation will put both you and your father at considerable risk." Daniel's protective instincts flared immediately. "Dr. Hassan, with all due respect, my daughter is 14 years old. Surely there are adult professionals, journalists, environmental lawyers, federal investigators, who would be better equipped to handle evidence of this magnitude." "Mr. Scott," Dr. Hassan replied, her tone carrying the weight of months of frustrated attempts to find help through official channels, "I have tried to contact investigative journalists, environmental protection agencies, and international human rights organizations. Each time, my reports disappear into bureaucratic processes or are dismissed as unreliable, because the evidence is primarily in languages that most American investigators cannot read or verify." She paused, allowing them to process the implications of systemic linguistic barriers in international law enforcement. Grace's ability to translate and verify documents in Arabic, Kurdish, and Farsi makes her uniquely valuable to this investigation. More importantly, her position inside Meridian Global gives her access to information that outside investigators could never obtain through official channels. Grace felt a surge of both pride and terror as she realized that her linguistic gifts had made her an essential component of exposing international crimes. The skills she'd developed for academic achievement and cultural understanding had evolved into tools for protecting vulnerable communities from corporate exploitation. "What exactly are you asking us to do?" Daniel said, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone negotiating terms that could fundamentally alter his family's safety and future. Dr. Hassan's response revealed the sophistication of her planning and the depth of her commitment to exposing Meridian's crimes. "I need Grace to continue documenting evidence from inside the company while I coordinate with international contacts who can provide legal and media support. But this must be done carefully, with security protocols that protect both Grace's cover and her physical safety." She outlined a communication system using encrypted messaging apps and predetermined code words that would allow them to share information without triggering Meridian surveillance systems. Grace would continue her internship while discreetly photographing documents and recording conversations that revealed the scope of the environmental conspiracy. "Most importantly," Dr. Hassan continued, "Grace needs to identify other employees who might be sympathetic to exposing these crimes. Corporations like Meridian depend on the silence and compliance of good people, who know that terrible things are happening but feel powerless to act." Grace's youth and linguistic abilities might allow her to build trust with employees who would never speak to an outside investigator. Daniel looked at his daughter, seeing in her expression the same determination that had characterized her approach to every challenge since childhood. Grace had never backed down from difficult situations when she believed that justice required her involvement. Whether defending classmates from bullies or advocating for better language education programs at her school. "If we do this," Daniel said slowly, "what kind of protection can you provide?" "If Meridian discovers what Grace is doing, they've already demonstrated their willingness to use intimidation and potentially violence to silence whistleblowers." Dr. Hassan's reply revealed that she'd been planning for exactly this scenario. "I have contacts within international environmental protection organizations and investigative journalism networks who can provide legal protection and media platform when we're ready to go public. But the timing must be perfect. We need enough evidence to ensure that Meridian cannot suppress or discredit our revelations." Grace reached across the table to squeeze her father's hand, understanding that her next words would commit both of them to a course of action that could potentially destroy their quiet suburban life, while simultaneously offering the possibility of saving thousands of lives in villages whose suffering had been deliberately hidden from the world. "Dad," she said quietly, "I can't pretend I didn't see those pictures of sick children. Dr. Hassan needs help, and I'm probably the only person in the world who can provide the specific kind of assistance that might actually make a difference. We have to try." The breakthrough moment had arrived, bringing with it the recognition that Grace's linguistic gifts carried responsibilities that extended far beyond academic achievement to encompass moral obligations that could no longer be ignored when children's lives hung in the balance. Grace's second week at Meridian Global began with a carefully orchestrated performance of teenage normalcy that masked the sophisticated intelligence operation she was now conducting from her corner desk. Armed with Dr. Hassan's security protocols and her father's reluctant but determined support, she transformed her internship from educational opportunity into undercover investigation, using her linguistic abilities to decode conversations that Meridian's executives assumed no American teenager could possibly understand. The first breakthrough came during a seemingly routine morning when Grace overheard a heated discussion between Victoria Sterling and two visiting executives from Meridian's international division. They spoke in rapid German, apparently confident that their conversation would remain private despite occurring in the open area near Grace's workstation. Her fluency in German, acquired during a family exchange program 3 years earlier, allowed her to understand every word of their increasingly angry debate. "The Syrian operation is becoming too expensive to maintain," the senior executive Klaus Weber was saying in German. 6 villages have been completely evacuated, and the local government is demanding higher compensation payments to keep the water contamination reports classified. Victoria's response revealed the callousness that drove Meridian's international operations. "Then, we accelerate the timeline. Extract everything valuable within the next 18 months and abandon the sites before the health effects become impossible to suppress. The initial investment will have paid for itself, and any long-term liability will become someone else's problem." Grace's hands trembled as she pretended to work on translation documents while mentally recording every detail of the conversation. These executives weren't just covering up environmental damage. They were actively planning to intensify operations that would worsen the contamination, affecting thousands of families. The timeline Victoria mentioned suggested that Meridian intended to extract maximum profits from their mining sites before fleeing the region, leaving behind devastated communities and poisoned landscapes. Klaus Weber's next comment made Grace's stomach lurch with horror. What about the Hassan problem? Our Dubai office reports that she's been making inquiries about legal representation and attempting to contact international environmental organizations. Dr. Hassan will be dealt with appropriately, Victoria replied, her tone carrying implications that made Grace's blood run cold. Our security consultants in the Middle East have extensive experience with managing problematic employees who threaten operational security. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, revealing details about bribery schemes, falsified environmental reports, and coordinated efforts to suppress medical research documenting the health effects of Meridian's operations. Grace photographed documents on her desk while simultaneously recording the German conversation using the discreet audio recording app that Dr. Hassan had recommended, her teenage familiarity with smartphone technology allowing her to multitask without drawing attention to her surveillance activities. The afternoon brought an unexpected complication when Thomas Chen, a junior financial analyst who worked in the cubicle adjacent to Grace's desk, approached with the nervous energy of someone preparing to share sensitive information. Thomas was roughly 25 years old, a recent MBA graduate whose idealistic expectations about corporate work had apparently been shattered by exposure to Meridian's business practices. "Grace," Thomas said quietly, glancing around to ensure their conversation wouldn't be overheard, "I've been watching you work on those translation projects, and I think you might be the right person to help me understand something that's been bothering me about our international accounts." Grace looked up from her documents, immediately recognizing the moral conflict in Thomas's expression. He carried the same haunted quality that she'd observed in Dr. Hassan, the look of someone who discovered information that challenged their fundamental assumptions about right and wrong. "What kind of information?" Grace asked carefully, using the same tone of professional interest that had encouraged Dr. Hassan to share her concerns. Thomas pulled out a folder containing financial documents that he placed discreetly beside Grace's translation materials. "These are budget allocations for what the company calls, quote, community development in our international operations. But when I compared the reported expenditures with the actual bank transfers, the numbers don't match. Millions of dollars that should be going to villages for infrastructure improvements are being diverted to offshore accounts." Grace examined the financial records with growing alarm, her mathematical abilities allowing her to quickly identify the discrepancies that Thomas had discovered. Meridian was claiming to spend substantial amounts on schools, medical clinics, and water purification systems for communities affected by their mining operations. But the actual expenditures were less than 10% of the reported amounts. "Where is the rest of the money going?" Grace asked, though she suspected the answer would reveal another layer of Meridian's systematic fraud. Thomas pointed to a series of transactions that appeared to be payments to consulting firms, with names like Regional Security Solutions and Environmental Compliance Associates. "I tried to research these companies, but they don't seem to have any legitimate business operations. No websites, no office addresses, no employees listed in professional directories." Grace felt pieces of the conspiracy clicking into place, as she realized that Meridian was using fake charitable expenditures to fund the very security operations and bribery schemes that enabled their environmental crimes. The money that should have been protecting affected communities was instead being used to silence anyone who attempted to document the harm being inflicted upon them. "Thomas," Grace said carefully, "have you shared these concerns with anyone else in the company?" His expression grew troubled as he shook his head. "I tried to ask my supervisor about the discrepancies, but she told me that international accounting involves complicated regulations that I don't understand yet. She said asking too many questions about specific transactions could create problems for my performance evaluation." The warning that Thomas had received was similar to the intimidation tactics that Victoria Sterling had used against Grace, suggesting that Meridian had systematic methods for suppressing employee concerns about the company's illegal activities. But Thomas's access to financial records provided a crucial piece of evidence that could link the environmental crimes to broader patterns of fraud and money laundering. Grace made a decision that would fundamentally expand the scope of their investigation while simultaneously increasing the danger to everyone involved. "Thomas, I think your instincts about these financial irregularities are correct. Would you be willing to help me document this information? I have contacts who might be able to provide proper authorities with evidence about what's really happening with Meridian's international operations. Thomas's relief was immediate and profound. He'd been carrying the burden of discovering corporate fraud without knowing how to address it through official channels, and Grace's offer of assistance provided an outlet for his moral concerns that wouldn't immediately jeopardize his career prospects. "You know people who can investigate financial crimes?" Thomas asked, his voice carrying hope mixed with apprehension about the potential consequences of whistleblowing. Grace nodded, understanding that she was about to reveal information that would make Thomas a target for the same corporate retaliation that had forced Dr. Hassan into exile. "I'm working with someone who's been documenting Meridian's environmental crimes. Your financial evidence could provide the missing piece that proves these aren't isolated incidents of corporate negligence, but systematic fraud designed to maximize profits while minimizing accountability." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jessica Park, who approached with the kind of forced cheerfulness that Grace had learned to associate with corporate surveillance disguised as employee wellness checks. "Grace, Thomas," Jessica said brightly, "I hope you're both finding opportunities to collaborate on projects. We encourage our interns and junior analysts to share knowledge and learn from each other's perspectives." The timing of Jessica's appearance felt too coincidental to be casual supervision. Grace suspected that their conversation had been monitored, possibly through electronic surveillance or simply by observant employees who reported unusual interactions to management. She responded with the same professional politeness that had allowed her to navigate Victoria Sterling's intimidation attempts. "Thomas was helping me understand some of the financial terminology in the international contracts I've been translating," Grace said smoothly. "It's helpful to get context about how the business side connects to the translation work." Jessica's smile remained in place, but Grace noticed that her eyes showed the calculating assessment of someone evaluating potential threats to corporate security. "Wonderful. Thomas, I'm sure Grace appreciates your mentorship. Just remember that some financial information requires confidentiality clearances that our intern program doesn't provide." After Jessica departed, Thomas looked visibly shaken by the subtle warning embedded in her seemingly supportive comments. "They're watching us," he said quietly. "I think they monitor email communications and possibly even desk conversations." Grace nodded, recognizing that their investigation had attracted corporate attention that could escalate to serious retaliation if they weren't extremely careful about their future communications. "We need to be smarter about how we share information. Can you make copies of those financial documents without triggering electronic logs?" Thomas's expression showed both fear and determination as he committed to providing evidence that could expose international fraud worth tens of millions of dollars. "I can print hard copies during off hours when the system monitoring is less active. But Grace, if they catch us, we're both going to face much worse consequences than just losing our jobs." The deepening bond between Grace and her growing network of allies had revealed the scope of Meridian's crimes while simultaneously attracting corporate surveillance that threatened everyone involved in the investigation. The small revelations that had begun with Dr. Hassan's environmental concerns were evolving into evidence of systematic international fraud that would require careful coordination to expose without triggering violent retaliation against the witnesses whose courage was making justice possible. The discovery that would transform their investigation from documenting environmental crimes to exposing a global conspiracy worth $100 million came at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday night when Grace received an emergency encrypted message from Dr. Hassan. The text, written in Kurdish script, was brief but terrifying. "They found my apartment. Escaping to safe house. Check dead drop location tomorrow morning. Evidence there will change everything. Trust no one at Meridian except the people you have already identified." Grace stared at her phone screen in the darkness of her bedroom, understanding that Dr. Hassan's worst fears about corporate retaliation had materialized into active pursuit by Meridian's security operatives. The environmental consultant was now a fugitive whose life depended on staying ahead of people with unlimited resources and no ethical constraints about eliminating witnesses to international crimes. The dead drop location that Dr. Hassan referenced was a public library branch in downtown Riverside District, 20 minutes from Grace's school by bus. She'd memorized the specific instructions during one of their encrypted conversations. Behind the third biography shelf on the second floor, taped inside the dust jacket of a book about environmental activists. The location's public nature provided security through anonymity, while ensuring that valuable evidence wouldn't be lost if something happened to Dr. Hassan. Grace arrived at the library during her lunch break the following day, her heart racing as she navigated the fiction section before quietly moving to the designated biography shelf. The book, a thick volume about Rachel Carson and the early environmental movement, contained a micro SD card and a handwritten note in Arabic that made Grace's hands shake as she translated the contents. The Envire. My young friend, Dr. Hassan had written, what I discovered before fleeing Dubai changes everything we thought we knew about Meridian's operations. They are not simply covering up environmental damage from mining activities. They are deliberately creating environmental disasters as part of a larger financial scheme involving insurance fraud, government manipulation, and international money laundering worth over $100 million. The micro SD card contained financial documents that Dr. Hassan had somehow obtained from Meridian's Dubai office, revealing a conspiracy that used environmental destruction as a tool for generating massive insurance payouts and government compensation claims. Meridian would establish mining operations in environmentally sensitive regions, purchase extensive insurance policies covering environmental accidents and cleanup costs, then deliberately cause the very disasters they'd insured against. Grace spent the afternoon in the library's computer lab, using her linguistic abilities to translate the Arabic and German documents that outlined the scheme's sophisticated structure. Meridian's executives had created a system where environmental catastrophes generated more profit than successful mining operations, incentivizing them to maximize damage to water supplies, agricultural systems, and human health. The financial records showed payments to corrupt government officials who would certify that environmental disasters were, quote, unforeseeable accidents rather than intentional crimes, enabling Meridian to collect insurance payouts while avoiding legal liability. Additional payments went to media companies that would suppress coverage of health effects, and to scientific institutions that would produce falsified studies, minimizing the scope of contamination. Most shocking of all were the actuarial calculations that treated human casualties as acceptable business expenses. Spreadsheets documented projected mortality rates for children and elderly residents in affected villages, with each death assigned a monetary value based on potential legal settlements and compensation claims. The executives weren't just ignoring the humanitarian consequences of their operations, they were actively calculating the optimal number of casualties that would maximize profits while minimizing regulatory response. Grace photographed every document on the micro SD card, understanding that she now possessed evidence of premeditated crimes against entire populations. The scope of Meridian's conspiracy extended far beyond the environmental crimes that Dr. Hassan had initially documented, encompassing systematic fraud that had generated hundreds of millions in illegal profits while destroying communities across 3 continents. The revelation was interrupted by her phone buzzing with a text from Thomas Chen. Emergency meeting. Found something that connects to your investigation. Coffee shop on 4th Street, 4 p.m. Come alone and watch for surveillance. Grace arrived at the designated coffee shop to find Thomas sitting in a corner booth, his normally composed demeanor replaced by obvious agitation. He'd placed a newspaper strategically to obscure their conversation from other customers while maintaining sight lines to the entrance and exits. Grace, Thomas said quietly as she sat down, I think I've figured out how Meridian's international fraud scheme works, and it's much worse than just stealing community development funds. He slid a folder across the table containing printouts of financial transactions that he'd discovered while conducting routine quarterly reviews of international accounts. Look at the timing of these insurance payments, Thomas said, pointing to a series of large deposits that coincided with environmental disasters at Meridian's mining sites. Grace examined the documents, her understanding of the conspiracy deepening as she recognized patterns that connected Thomas's financial evidence to Dr. Hassan's newly discovered materials. They're collecting insurance money for environmental disasters that they're causing intentionally, she realized aloud. Thomas nodded grimly. But it gets worse. I traced some of these insurance payouts, and portions of the money are being transferred to offshore accounts connected to government officials in the affected countries. Meridian isn't just committing insurance fraud, they're paying bribes to ensure that their environmental crimes won't be prosecuted. The conversation was interrupted by Thomas's sudden tension as he noticed something that made his face go pale. Grace, don't turn around, but there's a man at the counter who's been taking pictures of us with his phone. He's trying to be discreet, but I've seen him before in the Meridian building. Grace felt her chest tighten with fear as she realized that their investigation had triggered active surveillance by Meridian's security operatives. The corporate intimidation that had begun with subtle warnings and veiled threats was escalating to direct monitoring of their activities outside the office environment. "We need to leave separately," Grace said quietly, gathering the documents while maintaining the appearance of a casual conversation. "Meet me at the public park near the bus station in 30 minutes. We'll figure out how to share this information safely." Thomas nodded, understanding that their discovery of Meridian's insurance fraud scheme had made them targets for the same corporate retaliation that had forced Dr. Hassan into hiding. As Grace left the coffee shop through the rear exit, she used her phone's camera to discreetly photograph the surveillance operative, recognizing that documenting Meridian's intimidation tactics could provide additional evidence of their criminal conspiracy. The park meeting revealed the full scope of what they'd uncovered and the immediate danger they now faced. Thomas had discovered that Meridian's environmental disasters generated an average of $15 million in insurance payouts per incident, with 6 major disasters documented over the past 2 years. Combined with Dr. Hassan's evidence of deliberate contamination and Grace's documentation of the cover-up operations, they now possessed proof of a conspiracy worth over $100 million in fraudulent insurance claims and illegal government payments. "We have enough evidence to destroy Meridian," Grace said, reviewing the combined documentation that linked environmental crimes to systematic financial fraud. "But we also have enough evidence to get ourselves killed if they discover what we know." Thomas's expression reflected the same mixture of determination and terror that had characterized Dr. Hassan's communications from Dubai. "My financial access will be monitored more closely now that they've seen us meeting. And your translation work probably gives you access to documents that could provide even more evidence. But continuing the investigation will almost certainly trigger retaliation." Grace thought about the actuarial spreadsheets that calculated acceptable casualty rates for children in affected villages, understanding that Meridian's executives had already demonstrated their willingness to treat human lives as expendable business expenses. The same moral calculation that justified poisoning water supplies would certainly encompass eliminating teenage witnesses who threatened their $100 million fraud scheme. "Dr. Hassan is already in hiding because she tried to expose their environmental crimes," Grace said quietly. "If we stop now, those villages will continue suffering while Meridian collects insurance money for deliberately poisoning their children. We have to find a way to get this evidence to authorities who can't be bribed or intimidated." The first major revelation had arrived, bringing with it the recognition that their investigation had uncovered international crimes of staggering scope and sophistication. But the discovery also marked the moment when their amateur investigation would need to evolve into something much more dangerous and carefully coordinated if they hoped to expose the conspiracy while surviving the inevitable retaliation from people who'd already proven their willingness to eliminate anyone who threatened their criminal enterprise. The evidence they'd gathered could save thousands of lives and bring justice for communities that had been systematically poisoned for corporate profit. But using that evidence would require courage that extended far beyond anything Grace had previously imagined, and coordination with allies whose own safety would be jeopardized by their association with witnesses to crimes that powerful people had killed to keep hidden. The obstacles that emerged over the following week demonstrated the sophisticated nature of Meridian's defensive systems and the institutional failures that had enabled their crimes to continue undetected for years. Grace's attempt to contact the Environmental Protection Agency through their public whistleblower hotline resulted in a form letter acknowledging her concerns and a promise of investigation within 180 days, a timeline that would allow Meridian to complete their accelerated extraction operations and eliminate all evidence of wrongdoing. However, Daniel's consultation with the criminal defense attorney proved equally frustrating. Marcus Rivera, a respected lawyer who specialized in corporate crime cases, listened carefully to their evidence before delivering a devastating assessment of their legal options. "The documentation you've gathered is compelling," Rivera explained during their consultation in his downtown office. "But presenting it effectively would require coordination between multiple federal agencies, international law enforcement, and regulatory bodies in at least 3 different countries. The bureaucratic complexity alone could take years to navigate, assuming that Meridian doesn't use their political connections to suppress the investigation before it gains momentum." Rivera's concerns extended beyond procedural obstacles to encompass the personal danger that Grace and her allies would face if they pursued formal legal channels. Corporations with this level of international reach and financial resources have access to private security firms, political influence, and legal strategies that can destroy witnesses long before their testimony reaches a courtroom. Your daughter's age might provide some protection, but it also makes her testimony easier to discredit as the fantasy of an idealistic teenager who misunderstood complex business practices. The lawyer's assessment was reinforced by developments at Meridian that suggested Grace's investigation had been discovered by corporate security. Jessica Park approached Grace's desk on Monday morning with news that would effectively end her access to sensitive documents while simultaneously isolating her from potential allies within the company. "Grace, we have an exciting opportunity for you," Jessica announced with the kind of forced enthusiasm that Grace had learned to associate with corporate manipulation disguised as employee development. "Mr. Davidson in the Domestic Operations Department has requested your assistance with translation work focused on our North American partnerships. It's a wonderful chance to diversify your experience beyond international consulting." The transfer was presented as a promotion, but Grace immediately recognized it as corporate damage control designed to remove her from proximity to international operations, where she could continue documenting evidence of environmental crimes and financial fraud. The Domestic Operations Department occupied a different floor of the building, with no access to the executive conference rooms where she'd overheard conversations in German and Arabic that revealed Meridian's criminal activities. Thomas Chen faced even more direct retaliation for his financial investigations. His supervisor, Margaret Walsh, called him into her office Tuesday afternoon, with news that his quarterly performance review had identified, quote, "concerning patterns" in his work habits and professional judgment. "Thomas," Margaret said, consulting a folder that appeared to document his activities with suspicious thoroughness, "we've noticed that you've been accessing financial records outside your assigned responsibilities and asking questions about account structures that exceed your current clearance level. This kind of curiosity, while understandable in a new employee, raises concerns about your understanding of confidentiality protocols." The performance review included recommendations for additional training in corporate security procedures and a formal reprimand that would remain in Thomas's personnel file. More ominously, Margaret informed him that his access to certain financial databases would be restricted pending completion of an enhanced security clearance process that could take several months to complete. Grace and Thomas met that evening at a different location, a busy shopping mall food court where their conversation would be lost among dozens of other people while multiple exit routes remained available if they detected surveillance. The change in venue reflected their growing understanding that Meridian's security operations were more sophisticated and extensive than they'd initially realized. "They're systematically isolating us from the evidence," Thomas said quietly, picking at his food while scanning the surrounding area for familiar faces from the Meridian building. "My financial access is gone, your translation work is being redirected away from international operations, and Dr. Hassan is completely cut off from her sources inside the company." Grace nodded grimly, understanding that Meridian's response demonstrated both the value of the evidence they'd gathered and the company's commitment to suppressing it through any means necessary. "But they can't erase what we've already documented," she pointed out. "We have photographs, financial records, audio recordings, and Dr. Hassan's environmental data. The question is how to get that evidence to people who can act on it without being blocked by the same institutional failures that let Meridian operate for years without oversight." Their conversation was interrupted by Grace's phone buzzing with another encrypted message from Dr. Hassan, this one written in Farsi and containing information that would fundamentally alter their understanding of the opposition they faced. Contacted International Journalist Network, Dr. Hassan had written, "They confirm Meridian has connections to private intelligence contractors who specialize in suppressing environmental investigations. At least 4 other whistleblowers in different countries have disappeared or been discredited over past 3 years. We are not the first to discover their crimes, but we may be the last chance to expose them before they perfect their suppression techniques." The message continued with details that made Grace's hands shake as she translated the Farsi script for Thomas. Dr. Hassan had learned that Meridian's security operations included former intelligence operatives with experience in disinformation campaigns, witness intimidation, and what the international journalism community euphemistically called permanent solutions to persistent whistleblower problems. "She's saying that other people who tried to expose Meridian have been killed," Grace whispered, understanding that their investigation had evolved from risky activism to potentially fatal opposition to criminal organizations with unlimited resources and no ethical constraints. Thomas's expression reflected the same mixture of terror and determination that had characterized Dr. Hassan's communications since her forced exile. But she's also saying that we might be the last opportunity to stop them. If we give up now, they'll perfect their methods for silencing future whistleblowers, and communities like those villages will continue suffering while no one has the ability to help them. The institutional failures they'd encountered weren't accidental bureaucratic inefficiency. They were the result of systematic corruption that Meridian had cultivated over years of international operations. Environmental protection agencies, law enforcement organizations, and regulatory bodies had been compromised through a combination of political influence, financial incentives, and intimidation tactics that made official channels ineffective for addressing crimes of this magnitude. Grace realized that their amateur investigation had uncovered evidence that professional law enforcement had failed to discover, not because the crimes were hidden, but because the institutions responsible for investigating corporate malfeasance had been systematically compromised by the very companies they were supposed to regulate. "We need to go around the institutional failures," Grace said, understanding that conventional approaches to exposing corporate crime would result in their evidence disappearing into bureaucratic processes controlled by people with financial incentives to suppress whistleblower reports. Thomas pulled out his phone and showed Grace a news article that he'd discovered during his research into Meridian's political connections. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a story about congressional hearings on environmental crime that had been scheduled for the following month. Senator Patricia Hawkins chairs the Environmental Crimes Subcommittee, and she's been pushing for investigations into international corporate environmental violations. The article describes Senator Hawkins as a former environmental lawyer whose political career had been built on exposing corporate corruption and advocating for stronger oversight of international business operations. Unlike the bureaucratic agencies that had dismissed their concerns, Senator Hawkins had the political authority to demand congressional hearings and the media platform to ensure that evidence of corporate crimes received public attention that would be difficult to suppress. "If we can get our evidence to Senator Hawkins," Grace said, feeling hope for the first time since discovering the scope of Meridian's criminal conspiracy, "she might be able to force a public investigation that Meridian can't control through their usual intimidation and corruption tactics." But reaching Senator Hawkins would require overcoming the same security challenges that had made traditional whistleblower channels ineffective. Grace and Thomas would need to compile their evidence in a format that could be transmitted securely, while simultaneously protecting Dr. Hassan's identity and their own safety from corporate retaliation that had already proven fatal to other witnesses. The obstacles they faced weren't just bureaucratic inefficiency or corporate intimidation. They were the result of systematic institutional corruption that had been carefully cultivated to protect criminal enterprises like Meridian from the legal accountability that should have prevented their crimes. Overcoming those obstacles would require strategies that bypassed compromised institutions while simultaneously ensuring that their evidence reached people with the authority and integrity to act on it, despite the political and financial pressures that had silenced previous attempts at justice. The larger conspiracy that Grace would uncover during her final week of supposedly restricted access to Meridian's systems would dwarf even the $100 million insurance fraud scheme they'd already documented. While corporate security believed they'd successfully isolated her from sensitive information by transferring her to domestic operations, they'd actually positioned her to discover the central hub of an international criminal network that used environmental destruction as a cover for operations spanning 12 countries and generating over $500 million in illegal profits annually. Robert Davidson, Grace's new supervisor in domestic operations, proved to be an unwitting ally whose trust in her linguistic abilities provided access to documents that revealed Meridian's true scope of criminal activity. On Wednesday morning, he approached her desk with a folder containing what he described as routine translation verification for contracts involving Meridian's North American partnerships. "Grace, we've received some documents from our Canadian subsidiaries that involve French and Spanish components," Davidson explained, settling the folder beside her computer. "The legal department wants to ensure that our English translations accurately reflect the terms being discussed with our international partners. Standard verification work, but it requires someone with your multilingual capabilities." The contracts that Davidson had given Grace appeared routine on the surface: agreements for joint mining operations, equipment sharing arrangements, and consulting partnerships with companies throughout North America. But Grace's attention to linguistic detail revealed discrepancies between the English translations and the original French and Spanish texts that suggested deliberate misrepresentation of the contract's actual terms and purposes. The French documents described operations that were completely different from their English counterparts, where the English version outlined legitimate mining partnerships with Canadian companies. The French text detailed money laundering operations using mining equipment purchases to transfer funds between criminal organizations. Spanish contracts that appeared to establish consulting relationships with Mexican firms actually described human trafficking networks that used Meridian's transportation infrastructure to move people across international borders. Grace spent the morning photographing the contracts while pretending to conduct routine translation verification. Her linguistic abilities, allowing her to understand criminal operations that Meridian's executives had hidden behind language barriers they assumed no American teenager could penetrate. The documents revealed that environmental destruction was just one component of a comprehensive criminal enterprise that included money laundering, human trafficking, arms dealing, and systematic corruption of government officials across multiple nations. The breakthrough came when Grace discovered a master document written in Arabic that served as an operational overview of Meridian's international criminal activities. The file, labeled as Regional Security Assessment in English, actually contained detailed instructions for coordinating criminal operations across 3 continents, with environmental disasters serving as cover for activities that generated far more profit than legitimate business operations. According to the Arabic document, Meridian's executives had created what they called the Disaster Capitalism Protocol, a systematic approach to generating maximum profit from international crises while avoiding legal accountability through corruption, intimidation, and elimination of witnesses. Environmental disasters provided cover for looting natural resources. Human trafficking operations moved people displaced by contamination, and insurance fraud generated funding for bribes and private security operations. The financial scope was staggering. The Arabic document indicated that Meridian's criminal activities generated approximately $500 million annually, with environmental insurance fraud representing less than 20% of their total illegal revenue. The majority of their profits came from human trafficking networks that exploited environmental refugees, arms dealing operations that supplied weapons to conflicts in regions where Meridian operated, and money laundering services for other international criminal organizations. Grace realized that she'd been working for a company that used environmental consulting as cover for one of the world's largest international criminal syndicates. The mining operations, environmental disasters, and insurance fraud were just the visible components of criminal activities that extended far beyond anything she'd imagined when she first encountered Dr. Hassan's concerns about water contamination. Her discovery was interrupted by an emergency encrypted message from Dr. Hassan that contained information confirming Grace's worst fears about the danger they now faced. The message, written in Kurdish script, was brief but urgent. Learned from journalist contacts that Meridian has ordered, quote, permanent solutions for all witnesses to their operations. 3-person elimination team arrived in your city yesterday. Evidence suggests immediate threat to you, Thomas, and your family. Must act within 48 hours or lose opportunity forever. Grace stared at her phone screen, understanding that Dr. Hassan's warning meant that Meridian's security operatives were actively planning to murder everyone who possessed evidence of their criminal activities. The environmental consultant's research into international journalism networks had revealed that Meridian's standard response to whistleblower threats involved eliminating witnesses before they could share evidence with authorities, and Grace's linguistic abilities had made her a priority target for assassination. She immediately texted Thomas using their agreed-upon code words, family emergency, meet at the place we discussed, bring everything. The message would alert him to the immediate danger, while directing him to their predetermined emergency meeting location, a public transit station where they could quickly access multiple escape routes if they detected surveillance. Grace spent the remaining afternoon covertly documenting as much evidence as possible while maintaining the appearance of routine translation work. She photographed the Arabic operational overview, copied financial records that revealed the scope of Meridian's money laundering operations, and downloaded audio files containing conversations between executives discussing human trafficking logistics and weapons distribution networks. By 4 p.m., she'd compiled evidence that could expose criminal activities worth $500 million annually and potentially save thousands of lives by disrupting human trafficking networks and preventing future environmental disasters. But she'd also confirmed that Meridian's executives were willing to commit multiple murders to protect their criminal enterprise, and that her amateur investigation had made her family targets for assassination by professional killers. The emergency meeting with Thomas at the transit station revealed that he'd received similar warnings through his own network of contacts within Meridian's financial department. Marcus, An accountant who'd noticed irregular transactions had overheard conversations about cleaning up loose ends and ensuring operational security that suggested immediate action against identified security threats. "Grace," Thomas said quietly as they stood among commuters waiting for evening trains, "Marcus told me that Victoria Sterling has been meeting with people who aren't listed in any company directory, security consultants who specialize in what they call problem resolution. He thinks they've identified everyone who's been asking questions about the international operations." Grace shared her discovery of Meridian's criminal activities beyond environmental crimes, watching Thomas's expression grow increasingly horrified as she described human trafficking networks, arms dealing, and money laundering operations that generated hundreds of millions in illegal profits. The company they'd thought was covering up environmental damage to protect mining profits was actually using environmental destruction as cover for comprehensive international criminal activities. "We have evidence that could destroy the entire organization," Grace said, reviewing the documents she'd photographed during her final day of access to Meridian's systems. "But Dr. Hassan says we only have 48 hours before they eliminate everyone who knows about their operations." Thomas pulled out his own collection of financial documents that supported Grace's discoveries about the scope of Meridian's criminal activities. "The money flows I've been tracking connect to offshore accounts in the same countries where you found evidence of human trafficking and arms dealing. We're not just documenting environmental crimes. We're exposing one of the largest international criminal organizations in the world." The magnitude of what they'd uncovered was both exhilarating and terrifying. Their evidence could save thousands of lives by disrupting criminal networks that exploited vulnerable populations around the world, but using that evidence would require surviving assassination attempts by people with unlimited resources and professional training in eliminating witnesses to international crimes. Grace thought about the villages full of children whose water had been deliberately poisoned, the environmental refugees who'd been trafficked by the same company that displaced them, and the government officials who'd been corrupted to enable crimes against entire populations. The moral weight of that knowledge made the personal danger feel secondary to the responsibility of ensuring that their evidence reached people who could act on it. "We have to get this information to Senator Hawkins," Grace said, understanding that they'd moved beyond the point where personal safety could be prioritized over the moral obligation to expose crimes of this magnitude, even if it cost us everything. The larger conspiracy had revealed itself as a comprehensive criminal enterprise that used environmental destruction to cover activities that destroyed human lives on multiple continents. Grace's linguistic abilities had provided access to evidence that could dismantle criminal networks worth $500 million annually, but using that evidence would require courage that extended far beyond anything demanded by normal teenage experience. The point of no return arrived at 6:23 a.m. Friday morning when Daniel Scott discovered that their house was under surveillance by what appeared to be professional operatives positioned in vehicles across the street from their Willowbrook Heights townhouse. The black SUV with tinted windows had appeared sometime during the night, its occupants maintaining visual contact with the Scott family's front door, while attempting to blend into the suburban environment that had never before hosted this type of sophisticated surveillance operation. Daniel woke Grace immediately, his parental instincts recognizing that their quiet suburban life had been permanently shattered by forces that threatened not just their safety, but their very survival. "Sweetheart," he said quietly, shaking her shoulder while keeping his voice low enough to avoid detection by potential electronic surveillance. "We need to leave the house immediately. There are people watching us who aren't here for our protection." Grace's understanding of their situation was immediate and complete. The evidence she'd gathered about Meridian's international criminal operations had triggered the same corporate response that had forced Dr. Hassan into hiding and eliminated other whistleblowers who'd threatened the company's criminal activities. The professional killers that Dr. Hassan had warned about weren't just a theoretical threat, they were positioned outside her home, waiting for the optimal moment to eliminate witnesses whose testimony could destroy a $500 million criminal enterprise. "Dad," Grace whispered, gathering her laptop and the encrypted storage devices containing all the evidence they'd compiled, "we can't go to the police." Dr. Hassan's research showed that Meridian has connections to law enforcement agencies, and their security operatives have experience eliminating witnesses even when they're in protective custody. Daniel nodded grimly, understanding that traditional safety mechanisms were unavailable because Meridian's corruption extended through multiple levels of government and law enforcement. Their survival would depend on avoiding detection while simultaneously finding a way to transmit their evidence to people who couldn't be corrupted or intimidated by corporate influence. They exited through the rear door that opened onto the shared courtyard behind their row of townhouses, moving with the careful stealth that Daniel remembered from military training exercises decades earlier. Grace carried a backpack containing her laptop, documentation materials, and the communication devices that maintained their connection to Dr. Hassan's network of international contacts. The escape route that Daniel had mentally prepared during the anxious hours since discovering the surveillance took them through neighbors' backyards to a commercial district where they could access public transportation without being observed by the operatives monitoring their house. Grace's familiarity with the local bus system, developed through years of independent transportation to school activities, provided knowledge of routes that would take them to downtown areas where they could blend into crowds while planning their next moves. Where can we go that's safe but also gives us access to communication systems we need to contact Senator Hawkins? Daniel asked as they waited at a bus stop that offered multiple escape routes if they detected pursuit by Meridian's security operatives. Grace consulted her phone, which contained encrypted contact information for Dr. Hassan's network of international allies who specialized in protecting whistleblowers from corporate retaliation. Dr. Hassan mentioned a journalist named Rebecca Martinez who's been investigating international environmental crimes. She has secure communication facilities and experience protecting sources from corporate assassins. The bus ride to the downtown media district took 45 minutes, during which Grace and Daniel maintained constant vigilance for signs of surveillance while simultaneously planning their approach to Rebecca Martinez. The investigative journalist worked for an independent media organization that specialized in exposing corporate crimes, and her reputation for protecting sources had made her a trusted contact for whistleblowers throughout the international environmental community. Rebecca Martinez's office occupied the third floor of a building that housed several independent media organizations, its security systems designed to protect journalists who investigated powerful corporations and criminal organizations. When Grace and Daniel arrived unannounced, explaining their situation to the receptionist who screened visitors for potential security threats, they were immediately escorted to a conference room equipped with electronic countermeasures that would prevent corporate surveillance from monitoring their conversation. Rebecca Martinez proved to be a woman in her early 40s whose calm professionalism masked years of experience dealing with whistleblowers whose lives had been threatened by corporate retaliation. She listened carefully as Grace and Daniel described their discovery of Meridian's criminal operations, occasionally asking clarifying questions about the evidence they'd compiled and the immediate threats they were facing. Dr. Hassan contacted me yesterday, Rebecca said, confirming that their allies were coordinating efforts to expose Meridian's crimes through multiple channels simultaneously. She's provided preliminary evidence about environmental destruction and insurance fraud, but what you're describing suggests criminal activities on a much larger scale than anyone previously suspected. Grace opened her laptop and began displaying the evidence she'd compiled during her final week at Meridian, translating the Arabic, German, Spanish, and French documents that revealed the scope of the company's international criminal operations. Rebecca's expression grew increasingly grave as she examined proof of human trafficking networks, arms dealing operations, and money laundering activities that generated hundreds of millions in illegal profits. This evidence could destroy not just Meridian, but multiple criminal organizations that use their infrastructure for trafficking and weapons distribution, Rebecca said, photographing the documents while simultaneously uploading them to secure servers that would preserve the information even if Meridian's operatives eliminated the original witnesses. But getting this information to Senator Hawkins requires coordination that protects your safety while ensuring the evidence reaches congressional investigators who can act on it immediately. The journalist's assessment of their situation confirmed Grace's understanding that survival and justice were now inseparably linked. They couldn't remain safe while allowing Meridian's criminal activities to continue, and they couldn't expose the crimes without accepting risks that extended far beyond normal whistleblower challenges. Rebecca outlined a plan that would simultaneously protect their safety and ensure their evidence reached multiple authorities who could act on it despite corporate pressure to suppress investigation. Senator Hawkins is chairing emergency hearings on international environmental crimes next Wednesday. If we can coordinate testimony that presents your evidence alongside Dr. Hassan's environmental documentation and supporting materials from other sources, the public nature of congressional hearings will make it difficult for Meridian to eliminate witnesses without triggering federal investigation. The plan required Grace to formally testify before Congress about her linguistic discoveries at Meridian, using her unique abilities to translate and explain evidence that revealed criminal activities worth $500 million annually. But testifying would also make her a permanent target for corporate retaliation, fundamentally altering her life and requiring ongoing protection from people who'd already demonstrated their willingness to commit murder to protect their criminal enterprise. "Grace," Daniel said quietly, understanding the magnitude of what Rebecca was proposing, "testifying before Congress means accepting that our normal life is over. Meridian's operatives won't stop hunting us just because their crimes become public knowledge. Are you prepared for the consequences of making this choice?" Grace thought about the photographs she'd seen of children drinking contaminated water, the financial records documenting human trafficking operations, and the audio recordings of executives calculating acceptable casualty rates for communities affected by their environmental disasters. The moral weight of that evidence made the personal consequences feel secondary to the responsibility of ensuring that criminal activities affecting thousands of people were exposed and stopped. "Dad," she said, her voice carrying the determination that had characterized her approach to every challenge since childhood, "if we don't testify, those criminal operations will continue destroying communities while the people responsible perfect their methods for eliminating future witnesses." Dr. Hassan risked everything to document this evidence, and other whistleblowers died trying to expose these crimes. We can't let their sacrifices be meaningless. Rebecca's secure communication systems allowed them to contact Dr. Hassan's location in real time, coordinating testimony that would present comprehensive evidence about Meridian's criminal activities from multiple perspectives and linguistic sources. The environmental consultant's relief at learning that Grace and Daniel had survived Meridian's initial elimination attempts was audible even through encrypted communication channels. "My young friend," Dr. Hassan said, her voice carrying exhaustion mixed with hope, "your courage has made it possible to expose crimes that destroy communities across 3 continents. But testifying before Congress will make all of us permanent targets for people who've killed to protect these operations. Are you certain you're prepared for the consequences of this choice?" Grace looked at her father, understanding that her answer would commit both of them to a course of action that could save thousands of lives while fundamentally altering their own existence. The quiet suburban life they'd built together would be replaced by ongoing security concerns and the knowledge that powerful criminals would always consider them threats requiring elimination. "I'm certain," Grace said, accepting responsibility for consequences that extended far beyond her previous teenage experience. "These crimes have to be stopped, and we're the only people who can provide the evidence needed to stop them." The point of no return had been reached, bringing with it the recognition that survival and justice required accepting risks that no 14-year-old should face, but that couldn't be avoided when moral obligations intersected with unique capabilities that made action both possible and necessary. The public battle that would determine whether justice prevailed over corporate power began at 9:30 a.m. Wednesday morning when Grace Scott walked into the Hart Senate office building in Washington, D.C., carrying a briefcase containing evidence that could destroy a $500 million international criminal enterprise. The congressional hearing room buzzed with tension as journalists, environmental advocates, and corporate lawyers took their positions for what everyone understood would be a decisive confrontation between whistleblower testimony and sophisticated corporate damage control. Senator Patricia Hawkins opened the emergency subcommittee hearings on international environmental crimes with a statement that immediately established the gravity of the proceedings. "We are here today to examine allegations of systematic environmental destruction, insurance fraud, and criminal conspiracy involving American corporations operating in environmentally sensitive regions abroad. The testimony we will hear today has the potential to expose crimes that affect thousands of innocent people while generating hundreds of millions in illegal profits." Grace sat at the witness table beside Dr. Amira Hassan, who had arrived from Dubai under federal protection, and Rebecca Martinez, whose investigative journalism had provided crucial context for their evidence. Thomas Chen occupied a separate witness table, having been granted immunity in exchange for his cooperation in documenting Meridian's financial crimes. The arrangement ensured that their testimony would be coordinated and comprehensive, while providing legal protection for witnesses whose lives remained threatened by corporate retaliation. Meridian Global Corporation's response to the congressional hearings demonstrated the sophisticated nature of their defensive capabilities and the extent of their political influence. Victoria Sterling led a team of corporate attorneys, whose strategy became immediately apparent. discredit the witnesses' credibility, while simultaneously arguing that their evidence was based on misunderstandings of complex international business practices. Senator Hawkins, Victoria said during her opening statement, Meridian Global has cooperated fully with all regulatory inquiries and maintains the highest standards of environmental responsibility in our international operations. The allegations being presented today appear to stem from language barriers and cultural misunderstandings that have led well-meaning but inexperienced individuals to misinterpret routine business communications. The corporate strategy of dismissing Grace's linguistic abilities as cultural misunderstandings immediately backfired when she began presenting her evidence. Speaking directly to the senators while simultaneously providing real-time translation of the Arabic, German, Spanish, and French documents that revealed Meridian's criminal activities, Grace demonstrated a level of linguistic sophistication that made claims about misunderstanding appear ridiculous. Senator Hawkins, Grace said, displaying the Arabic operational overview on large screens throughout the hearing room. This document, which Meridian labeled as a, quote, regional security assessment, actually contains detailed instructions for coordinating criminal operations across 3 continents. The Arabic text specifically describes what they call the disaster capitalism protocol, a systematic approach to generating maximum profit from environmental disasters while avoiding legal accountability. Grace's translation of the document revealed criminal activities that extended far beyond environmental crimes to encompass human trafficking, arms dealing, and money laundering operations. As she explained the linguistic nuances that revealed Meridian's true intentions, the hearing room fell silent with the recognition that her testimony was exposing international crimes of staggering scope and sophistication. Dr. Hassan's testimony provided scientific context for Grace's linguistic evidence, presenting environmental data that documented systematic contamination of water supplies, agricultural systems, and human health in communities near Meridian's operations. Her expertise as an environmental consultant, combined with her fluency in Arabic and Kurdish, allowed her to present testimony from affected villagers that had never before been heard by American authorities. Senator Hawkins, Dr. Hassan said, displaying photographs of children with severe health problems caused by Meridian's operations. These images were taken in villages where Meridian deliberately contaminated water supplies to maximize insurance payouts. The company's executives calculated that environmental disasters would generate more profit than successful mining operations, so they systematically poisoned communities while collecting millions in fraudulent insurance claims. Thomas Chen's financial testimony provided the economic foundation that connected environmental crimes to broader patterns of international fraud. His access to Meridian's accounting systems had revealed money flows that supported Grace's linguistic evidence, and Dr. Hassan's environmental documentation, creating a comprehensive picture of criminal activities worth hundreds of millions annually. The financial records show systematic diversion of funds that should have supported affected communities, Thomas testified, presenting spreadsheets that documented Meridian's fraudulent charitable claims. Money that Meridian reported as spending on schools, medical clinics, and water purification systems was actually transferred to offshore accounts that funded bribery, intimidation, and elimination of witnesses who threatened their operations. The corporate pushback intensified as Grace's testimony continued, with Meridian's attorneys attempting to exploit her age and inexperience to undermine her credibility. But their strategy backfired spectacularly when Grace responded to their challenges by providing even more detailed linguistic analysis that revealed criminal activities the attorneys apparently hadn't realized she'd discovered. Ms. Scott, Victoria Sterling said during her cross-examination, "You're asking this committee to believe that a high school student with no corporate experience could understand complex international business agreements better than professional translators and experienced executives." Grace's response demonstrated the intellectual maturity that had enabled her to uncover Meridian's crimes while simultaneously revealing the full scope of evidence she possessed. "Ms. Sterling, I'm asking this committee to believe documented evidence that your company has systematically poisoned children in 12 countries while generating over $500 million in criminal profits annually. Would you like me to translate the audio recordings where you personally discussed eliminating Dr. Hassan if she continued documenting your environmental crimes?" The threat to play audio recordings of Victoria Sterling discussing assassination plans sent shockwaves through the hearing room and triggered immediate responses from federal law enforcement agencies that had been monitoring the proceedings. Grace's linguistic abilities had provided access to evidence that even professional investigators hadn't obtained. and her willingness to present that evidence publicly had trapped Meridian's executives in admissions of criminal activity. Senator Hawkins recognized the significance of what was unfolding and moved to ensure that Grace's testimony received the protection and platform it deserved. Ms. Scott, this committee wants to hear every piece of evidence you've gathered about Meridian's international operations. The American people have a right to know when corporations use environmental destruction to cover criminal activities that affect vulnerable populations around the world. The live broadcast of the congressional hearings ensured that Grace's testimony reached global audiences who could hold their own governments accountable for enabling Meridian's crimes through regulatory failures and corruption. International media coverage provided protection for the witnesses while simultaneously applying pressure on law enforcement agencies to investigate criminal activities that had been hidden behind language barriers and institutional corruption. Rebecca Martinez's journalistic testimony provided crucial context about how Meridian's crimes connected to broader patterns of corporate impunity and regulatory capture that enabled international criminal organizations to operate with minimal accountability. Her investigation had revealed that Meridian's methods were being copied by other corporations that recognized the profitability of using environmental disasters to cover systematic criminal activity. Senator Hawkins, Rebecca testified, Meridian Global represents a new model of international crime that uses legitimate business operations as cover for activities that generate more profit than legal business practices. Their success has inspired other corporations to adopt similar strategies, creating a trend toward what intelligence analysts call, quote, corporate criminal syndicates that pose threats to international security and human rights. As the day's testimony concluded, it became clear that Grace's linguistic abilities had provided law enforcement with evidence needed to dismantle not just Meridian's criminal operations, but broader networks of corporate crime that had operated with impunity for years. Her courage in presenting that evidence publicly had created momentum for international investigations that Meridian's political influence couldn't suppress or control. The public battle had been won through the power of documented truth presented by witnesses whose linguistic abilities and moral courage had overcome corporate strategies designed to suppress accountability. But the victory also meant that Grace, Dr. Hassan, Thomas, and their families would require ongoing protection from criminal organizations whose activities had been exposed but not yet completely dismantled. The congressional hearings had provided a platform where truth could prevail over corporate power. But the fight for justice would continue as law enforcement agencies worked to arrest criminals and dismantle networks that had operated across multiple countries and legal jurisdictions. Grace's testimony had started a process that would take years to complete, but her linguistic gifts had made that process possible by providing evidence that no corporate defense strategy could successfully challenge or suppress. Victory through voice manifested itself in the weeks following Grace's congressional testimony, as federal agencies across 3 countries began coordinated arrests that dismantled criminal networks worth over $500 million annually. The FBI's International Crimes Division, working with Interpol and environmental protection agencies in 12 nations, launched Operation Clearwater, the largest international investigation of corporate environmental crimes in history, made possible by Grace's linguistic evidence and Dr. Hassan's scientific documentation. Victoria Sterling's arrest at Washington Dulles International Airport, as she attempted to flee to a non-extradition country with falsified diplomatic documents, became the symbolic moment when corporate power yielded to evidence-based justice. The audio recordings that Grace had threatened to release during her congressional testimony provided federal prosecutors with irrefutable proof of Sterling's involvement in conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and environmental terrorism across multiple jurisdictions. The FBI's seizure of Meridian Global's headquarters revealed additional evidence that supported every aspect of Grace's testimony while uncovering criminal activities that even her linguistic abilities hadn't detected. Corporate computers contained detailed operational plans for expanding human trafficking networks, arms-dealing partnerships with international criminal organizations, and systematic bribery schemes that had corrupted government officials in 14 countries. Within 10 days of the congressional hearings, federal prosecutors had filed criminal charges against 47 Meridian executives and associates, with additional investigations proceeding in Canada, Mexico, Syria, Yemen, and Kurdistan. The international coordination required to prosecute crimes spanning multiple legal systems demonstrated how Grace's evidence had provided law enforcement agencies with the foundation needed to overcome jurisdictional obstacles that had previously protected corporate criminals from accountability. Dr. Hassan's vindication came through the establishment of international medical missions that began providing treatment for communities affected by Meridian's environmental crimes. The World Health Organization, responding to public pressure generated by the congressional hearings, allocated emergency funding for treating children and adults whose health had been destroyed by systematic water and soil contamination. Village testimonials that Dr. Hassan had preserved in Arabic and Kurdish became the basis for medical interventions that saved lives, while documenting evidence for future war crimes prosecutions. Thomas Chen's financial analysis enabled federal investigators to freeze offshore accounts containing over $200 million in assets derived from Meridian's criminal activities. The Asset Forfeiture Division announced that recovered funds would be distributed to affected communities for environmental remediation, medical treatment, and infrastructure reconstruction. Thomas's cooperation with ongoing investigations earned him protection under federal witness security programs, while providing him with opportunities to use his accounting expertise to help other whistleblowers expose corporate financial crimes. The media coverage that followed Rebecca Martinez's reporting on the congressional hearings triggered additional investigations of corporations using similar environmental destruction strategies to cover criminal operations. Her Pulitzer Prize-winning series, Corporate Criminal Syndicates: The New Face of International Crime, documented how Meridian's methods had influenced other companies to adopt environmental terrorism as a profitable business model. Grace's unique position as the linguistic key that unlocked international criminal evidence led to recognition that transcended typical whistleblower acknowledgement. The United Nations Environmental Program awarded her their Youth Environmental Hero designation, while the International Association of Translators created the Grace Scott Award for Linguistic Courage to recognize translators whose work exposed crimes against humanity. But the most meaningful recognition came from the communities whose suffering Grace's testimony had helped alleviate. Video messages from villagers in Kurdistan, Syria, and Yemen, speaking in their native languages while holding photographs of children whose health had improved since Meridian's operations ended, demonstrated the human impact of her courage in ways that official awards couldn't capture. The legal proceedings that followed Grace's testimony revealed the sophisticated nature of international corporate crime, while demonstrating how linguistic barriers had enabled criminal activities to continue undetected for years. Federal prosecutors credited Grace's multilingual abilities with providing evidence that professional investigators had never accessed, highlighting systemic failures in international law enforcement that depended too heavily on English-language sources. Meridian Global Corporation's dissolution became inevitable as criminal prosecutions revealed that legitimate business activities represented less than 30% of the company's revenue, with the majority of operations focused on activities that violated international laws against environmental terrorism, human trafficking, and systematic corruption of government institutions. Shareholder lawsuits, criminal asset forfeitures, and regulatory sanctions eliminated the corporate structure that had enabled international crimes affecting thousands of people across multiple continents. The congressional hearings had also triggered legislative responses that addressed regulatory failures enabling corporate criminal activities. Senator Hawkins introduced the International Corporate Accountability Act, requiring American companies with overseas operations to submit multilingual compliance reports that could be verified by independent translators, with security clearances sufficient to detect criminal activities hidden behind language barriers. Dr. Hassan's transition from exiled whistleblower to internationally recognized environmental advocate demonstrated how individual courage could catalyze institutional changes that protected vulnerable communities from corporate exploitation. Her appointment as Director of Environmental Justice for the United Nations provided a platform for applying lessons learned from the Meridian investigation to prevent similar crimes by other corporations operating in developing regions. The protection program that kept Grace and her family safe from ongoing corporate retaliation also provided opportunities for her to continue using her linguistic abilities in service of international justice. Federal agencies consulting with her on other investigations discovered that American teenagers with advanced multilingual skills could access criminal evidence that professional investigators consistently missed due to cultural and linguistic barriers. Grace's testimony had established legal precedents that recognized children's unique capabilities as witnesses to international crimes, while providing protection mechanisms that enabled young people to expose corporate wrongdoing without sacrificing their safety or future opportunities. The Grace Scott Protocols, developed by federal witness protection programs, created frameworks for supporting teenage whistleblowers whose special abilities made them valuable assets in exposing international criminal activities. The ripple effects of Grace's courage extended far beyond the specific crime she'd exposed, inspiring other young people with linguistic abilities to recognize their potential roles in documenting and exposing international injustice. Language schools reported increased enrollment in Arabic, Kurdish, and other languages commonly used by international criminal organizations, with students explicitly citing Grace's example as motivation for developing skills that could serve justice and human rights. The Meridian investigation had demonstrated that corporate criminals' reliance on language barriers for operational security could be overcome by determined individuals whose linguistic gifts provided access to evidence that traditional investigative methods couldn't obtain. Grace's success encouraged law enforcement agencies to develop programs that recruited and trained multilingual young people as specialized investigators capable of penetrating criminal networks that had previously operated with impunity. 6 months after her congressional testimony, Grace's voice had evolved from that of a frightened teenager exposing corporate crimes to that of an internationally recognized advocate, whose linguistic abilities continued serving communities threatened by environmental terrorism and corporate exploitation. Her transformation from summer intern to defender of international justice demonstrated how individual courage, combined with unique skills and moral determination, could overcome institutional failures that enabled systematic crimes against vulnerable populations. The victory achieved through Grace's voice had saved thousands of lives while establishing legal precedents and investigative methods that would protect future communities from corporate criminals who relied on language barriers and institutional corruption to avoid accountability for crimes against humanity. Her testimony had proven that truth, when supported by linguistic evidence and moral courage, could prevail over corporate power structures that had seemed invulnerable to conventional legal challenges. The continuing impact of Grace's linguistic testimony ensured that her voice would resonate through international justice systems for years to come, protecting communities whose suffering had previously been hidden behind language barriers that powerful criminals had exploited to avoid accountability for systematic environmental terrorism and human rights violations. 2 years after her congressional testimony, Grace Scott stood before an audience of international diplomats at the United Nations headquarters in New York City, addressing the Global Summit on Environmental Justice with the confident authority of someone whose voice had already changed the world. At 16, she served as the youngest special advisor to the UN Environmental Program, her linguistic abilities having evolved from teenage talent to professional expertise that continued exposing international crimes while protecting vulnerable communities across multiple continents. The ceremony that morning honored the completion of environmental restoration projects in the 12 communities most severely affected by Meridian Global's deliberate contamination. Clean water flowed through villages in Kurdistan, Syria, and Yemen, where children had once suffered from systematically poisoned wells. Agricultural programs had restored soil fertility to regions where Meridian's operations had deliberately destroyed farming capabilities. Medical clinics provided ongoing treatment for families whose health had been damaged by corporate environmental terrorism, funded by the asset forfeitures that Grace's evidence had made possible. Daniel Scott watched his daughter address world leaders with the same pride he'd felt watching her practice sign language in their kitchen, but tempered by understanding of the extraordinary path that had brought them from their quiet suburban life to the center of international justice efforts. Their modest townhouse in Willowbrook Heights had been replaced by a secure residence outside Washington, D.C., where Grace could continue her work while maintaining the family stability that remained essential despite their transformed circumstances. The protection protocols that surrounded their daily life were nearly invisible but absolutely necessary. Meridian's criminal network had been dismantled, but other corporate criminals had learned from their methods while adapting defensive strategies that recognized the threat posed by multilingual witnesses capable of penetrating their operational security. Grace's consulting work with federal agencies required security measures that balanced her access to criminal evidence with protection from retaliation by people whose activities she continued to expose. Dr. Amira Hassan joined Grace at the podium, her transformation from exiled whistleblower to internationally recognized environmental advocate complete but marked by understanding that vigilance remained essential. Her work with the United Nations had revealed that Meridian's methods were being copied by other corporations that recognized the profitability of using environmental destruction to cover systematic criminal activities, requiring ongoing investigation by multilingual specialists capable of detecting evidence hidden behind language barriers. Grace's courage in exposing Meridian's crimes has saved thousands of lives, Dr. Hassan said, addressing the assembled diplomats while translating simultaneously into Arabic for representatives from affected regions. But her work has also revealed systematic failures in international law enforcement that enabled corporate criminals to operate with impunity for years. The linguistic barriers that protected corporate environmental terrorism must never again shield criminal activity from accountability. Thomas Chen's presence at the ceremony represented the broader community of corporate whistleblowers, whose financial and operational expertise had become essential to exposing international business crimes. His transition from nervous junior analyst to federal consultant specializing in corporate money laundering had been facilitated by witness protection programs that recognize the ongoing value of his accounting expertise in dismantling criminal financial networks. The Thomas Chen Center for Financial Crime Investigation, established with recovered Meridian assets, provided training for accountants and financial analysts whose work could expose corporate criminal activities before they achieved the scale and sophistication that had made Meridian so destructive. His collaboration with Grace on ongoing investigations demonstrated how linguistic and financial evidence could be combined to penetrate corporate criminal operations that traditional law enforcement methods had failed to detect. Rebecca Martinez's journalistic work had expanded from documenting individual corporate crimes to investigating systematic regulatory failures that enabled international criminal enterprises to operate across multiple jurisdictions. Her Meridian investigation had earned recognition not just for exposing specific crimes, but for revealing how corporate criminals exploited institutional weaknesses that prevented coordination between law enforcement agencies in different countries. The Rebecca Martinez Institute for Investigative Journalism provided secure platforms for whistleblowers whose evidence could expose international crimes while protecting sources from corporate retaliation. Grace's ongoing collaboration with international journalists had created networks that could rapidly disseminate evidence of corporate criminal activities while providing protection for witnesses whose linguistic abilities made them targets for elimination by criminal organizations. Grace's address to the UN summit focused on the continuing challenges posed by corporate criminals who had adapted their methods in response to the Meridian investigation. New criminal organizations used more sophisticated encryption methods, distributed their operations across more jurisdictions, and employed counterintelligence techniques designed to prevent linguistic penetration of their operational security. The victory against Meridian Global was just the beginning of a longer struggle against corporate criminals who use environmental destruction to cover systematic human rights violations, Grace told the assembled diplomats, her words translated simultaneously into 12 languages by the team of interpreters she'd helped train. These criminal organizations continue evolving their methods, requiring international cooperation and linguistic expertise to expose activities that threaten vulnerable communities around the world. The legislative changes that had resulted from Grace's testimony continued generating momentum for international accountability mechanisms that addressed corporate environmental crimes. The International Environmental Crimes Court, established through treaty negotiations inspired by the Meridian case, provided legal venues for prosecuting corporate executives whose activities constituted environmental terrorism against civilian populations. Grace's testimony had been instrumental in defining legal standards that recognized environmental destruction as a weapon of war when used systematically against civilian communities. The Geneva Convention amendments that resulted from her evidence established international legal frameworks for prosecuting corporate environmental terrorism while protecting communities whose resources made them targets for criminal exploitation. The educational programs that Grace had helped develop were training new generations of multilingual investigators whose linguistic abilities could expose international crimes before they achieved devastating scope. The Grace Scott Academy for International Justice provided specialized education for young people whose language skills could serve law enforcement agencies, international courts, and human rights organizations working to prevent corporate crimes against vulnerable populations. Students at the Academy learned not just translation techniques, but investigative methods that could detect criminal evidence hidden behind cultural and linguistic barriers that traditional law enforcement agencies couldn't penetrate. Grace's teaching emphasized the moral responsibilities that accompanied linguistic abilities, ensuring that future investigators understood their obligations to communities whose suffering could only be documented and exposed through multilingual expertise. The memorial garden that Grace and her father had planted behind their new home honored not just the communities that had suffered from Meridian's crimes, but the whistleblowers who had died attempting to expose corporate environmental terrorism in other countries. Each plant represented lives that had been saved through their courage, while acknowledging lives that had been lost to corporate retaliation before international protection mechanisms could be established. As evening approached, Grace walked through the garden with Daniel, their relationship having evolved from father protecting daughter to partners in ongoing work that required both courage and careful attention to security. The quiet moments they shared among the memorial plantings provided necessary respite from the intensity of international justice work while reminding them that their transformed life had grown from seeds of moral determination rather than desire for recognition or adventure. "Do you ever miss our old life?" Daniel asked, settling onto the bench they'd positioned to overlook both the memorial plants and the security perimeter that protected their property from ongoing threats. Grace considered the question carefully, understanding that their journey from suburban normalcy to international advocacy had required sacrifices that continued affecting every aspect of their daily existence. "I miss the simplicity," she replied honestly. "But I can't imagine choosing personal comfort over the responsibility that comes with being able to help communities that would otherwise suffer in silence." The evening news carried reports of new corporate environmental crimes being investigated by international agencies using methods that Grace's testimony had helped develop. Multilingual investigators were exposing criminal activities in regions where corporate criminals had assumed language barriers would protect their operations from scrutiny. The ripple effects of her courage continued expanding through international justice systems that had learned to recognize and overcome the linguistic obstacles that had previously enabled systematic crimes against vulnerable populations. The family they had become through choice rather than circumstance included Dr. Hassan, Thomas, Rebecca, and the growing community of whistleblowers whose courage had been inspired by Grace's example. Their bonds had been forged through shared commitment to protecting communities whose suffering had been hidden behind language barriers that powerful criminals had exploited to avoid accountability. As night settled over their memorial garden, Grace understood that her voice would continue serving international justice for years to come, exposing crimes that threatened vulnerable communities, while inspiring other young people to recognize their potential roles in protecting human rights through linguistic expertise and moral courage. The quiet suburban life they'd left behind had been replaced by ongoing responsibility for communities whose survival often depended on people willing to speak truth across any linguistic or cultural barrier. The transformation from Daniel and Grace Scott, architect and student, to defenders of international environmental justice demonstrated how individual courage, combined with unique abilities and unwavering moral determination, could overcome institutional failures that enabled systematic crimes against humanity. Their story had become inspiration for anyone whose special skills carried obligations to serve justice when conventional systems failed to protect the most vulnerable members of the human community. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.